For as long as Dungeons & Dragons has existed, video game developers have been trying to capture the magic of the pen and paper experience in their own games. And over the decades, this has produced some of the most incredible RPGs ever created, and a fair share of duds. Today, D&D is bigger than ever, and preparing to reawaken one of its most beloved video game series ever. So let's take a look at how we got here, through the storied history of D&D video games. Everything begins in the mid-70s, following the original publication of Dungeons & Dragons with a game that was simply titled D&D or the Game of Dragons. Of course, by today's standards it looks very primitive, but D&D was groundbreaking for its time, and is credited as being one of the earliest video games to feature non-linear progression and bosses. Throughout the mid to late 70s, there are a few other unofficial products released, but eventually in the early 80s, the first officially licensed games began to appear, such as the Dungeons & Dragons computer fantasy game from Mattel, a standalone package that promised sophisticated LCD graphics, exciting action sounds, and was powered by 2 whole watch batteries. Next, in 1982, we got both a computerized version of the board game Dungeon and Advanced Dungeons & Dragons Cloudy Mountain for the Intellivision. However, while Cloudy Mountain used a fantasy setting, it didn't really draw anything else from the tabletop game outside of the name, although it did still get a sequel the following year called The Treasure of Tarmin. A few years would pass before anything else official would release, possibly due to the video game crash of 1983 that put the entire industry into recession. However, by 1988, SSI had won the license to produce games based on the official D&D rules, and they kicked things off with what many people consider to be the first real D&D video game, Pool of Radiance. The game was a smash hit, outselling competitors like Ultima 5 and Bard's Tale 3, and becoming the most successful game in SSI's history, resulting in them launching 3 direct sequels over the next few years. However, staying in 1988 for a moment, SSI also released the game Heroes of the Lance, an action-focused side-scroller based in the Dragonlance setting. Unfortunately, it was not as popular with gamers as Pool of Radiance was, and was largely overshadowed. However, it did still manage to get a sequel called Dragons of Flame the following year. 1989 also saw the release of Hillsfar, an RPG that used minigames from everything from lockpicking to riding a horse, although sadly these quickly became repetitive, with one critic calling Hillsfar graphically unexciting and mentally uninteresting. Then in the following year, we got 2 versions of the game Dragon Strike, with the PC version being a full-on dragon flight simulator and the NES version functioning more like a top-down shooter. 1990 also saw the release of Champions of Krynn, which brought the Pool of Radiance mechanics into the Dragonlance setting and kicked off another series of successful games. Another series to begin in 1990 was Eye of the Beholder, in which a team of adventurers in the city of Waterdeep faced off against the most notorious beholder of all time, Xanathar. In 1991, Eye of the Beholder got its first sequel, the Pool of Radiance series wrapped up with its final game, and we also got Death Knights of Krynn, the previously mentioned sequel to Champions. We also got Shadow Sorcerer, which was a follow-up to the Heroes of the Lance and Dragons of Flame, as well as both Gateway to the Savage Frontier and the MMORPG Neverwinter Nights. Neverwinter Nights was the first MMORPG to display graphics, and initially had a server capacity of just 50 players. However, over the next few years, this would grow to 500, and the player base itself would reach over 115,000 people in total as a part of the AOL subscriber service. In 1992, we got 2 of the last few games in the Gold Box series that had begun with Pool of Radiance. However, both the Dark Queen of Krynn and Treasures of the Savage Frontier were not as well received as their predecessors. This year also saw the release of the first game set in Mystara, Order of the Griffin and Warriors of the Eternal Sun, as well as the first Spelljammer game, Pirates of Realmspace. By 1993, the Gold Box engine that had been powering most of these games for the past 5 years was starting to show its age, and the final game to be developed using it, Forgotten Realms Unlimited Adventure, drew a lot of criticism, but it was far from the only game released that year. We also got the third and final Eye of the Beholder game, Dungeon Hack, and the much loved Dark Sun Shattered Lands. Outside of the RPG genre, we also got the city building RTS Stronghold and wargame Fantasy Empires. 1994 was an important year in D&D video game history, as this was when SSI lost their exclusive license and we began to get an influx of new games, such as Slayer and the instant classic Tower of Doom, a side-scrolling beat-em-up from Capcom that was a massive hit in arcades. However, SSI was still the biggest fish in the D&D video game pond, and they published various collector's editions of their previous games, as well as a sequel to Dark Sun, Ravenloft Strahd's Possession, Alquadim the Genie's Curse, and Menzo Barazan. These games all received fairly mixed reviews, but the variety of settings covered in just this one year is somewhat impressive to look back on. Things were a lot quieter in 95, with only one new release, Ravenloft Stone Prophet, a sequel to Strahd's Possession that most people agree was a solid improvement on the games from the previous year. In 1996 we got the second D&D MMO with the release of Dark Sun Online Crimson Sands, which served as AT&T's version of Neverwinter Nights, yet it never achieved the success of its predecessor and was shut down just 2 years later. Unfortunately, the bad news didn't stop there, as other new releases such as Deathkeep and RTS Blood and Magic also suffered poor reviews, with the latter in particular being vastly overshadowed by Warcraft 2. Still, it wasn't all doom and gloom, as this year also saw the release of another arcade classic, Shadows over Mystara, that pulled RPG-style mechanics into a beat-em-up. There was a plot, good graphics, and interesting gameplay, which all came together to make the game another hit for Capcom. Outside of the arcade, the other new game this year was Birthright: The Gorgon's Alliance, a turn-based strategy game that certainly had its flaws, but is still of note for being the only video game ever to be based in the Birthright setting. In 1997, Wizards of the Coast purchased TSR, the makers of D&D, and we also got two new games. The first was Descent into Undermountain, where you eventually came face to face with the Queen of Spiders herself, Lolth, and the second was Iron and Blood: Warriors of Ravenloft, a 3D fighting game for PC and PlayStation that received negative reviews almost unanimously. Now we reach 1998 and the beginning of the most beloved D&D series in history, with the release of Baldur's Gate. This was only the second game to ever come out of BioWare, long before they became the brains behind titles like Knights of the Old Republic, Mass Effect and Dragon Age. Although their publisher didn't have very high hopes for Baldur's Gate and set the worldwide sales goal at just 200,000 units. However, the game was a critical and commercial hit and sold at a staggering rate, with its first 50,000 copies selling out immediately and critics praising nearly every aspect of the game. It won numerous Game of the Year awards, and BioWare quickly followed up on their success with the expansion pack Tales of the Sword Coast. But this was just the beginning of this new wave of Dungeons & Dragons games, as BioWare's sister developer Black Isle Studios released Planescape Torment in 1999. Things didn't slow down in the year 2000, when both studios released new games, Icewind Dale from Black Isle and Baldur's Gate 2 from BioWare. Once again, both games were well received by critics and fans alike, although the Baldur's Gate sequel in particular became an instant Hall of Fame classic, not just for D&D games, but for video games entirely. In 2001, both games received expansions, and we also got Baldur's Gate Dark Alliance for various consoles, which along with Pool of Radiance, Ruins of Myth Draenor, became the first games to fully implement the new rules from the 3rd edition of the pen and paper game. In 2002, we got the positively received sequel to Icewind Dale, as well as an adaptation of Eye of the Beholder for the Game Boy Advance. Yet probably the most notable game from this year was Neverwinter Nights from BioWare, not to be confused with the 1991 game of the same name that by this point in time had been shut down. The game's campaign was playable in both single and multiplayer modes, and the Windows version offered a toolset for the creation of custom content. The game quickly put many new awards onto the shelves of BioWare's offices, and sold over 1 million copies before the release of its first expansion the following year. In fact, by the end of 2003, we had actually gotten 2 expansions for Neverwinter Nights, as well as the first games located in the Greyhawk setting. Dungeons & Dragons Heroes was an Xbox exclusive hack and slash game with some RPG elements mixed in that was met with fairly average reviews. The Temple of Elemental Evil, on the other hand, was a Windows exclusive that was fairly well received. In 2004, we got a sequel to Baldur's Gate Dark Alliance, as well as a series of premium modules for Neverwinter Nights. Forgotten Realms Demonstone was also released and was written by R.A. Salvatore, the writer of the Driss stories, and featured the voice of Patrick Stewart as Kelvin Blackstaff.
And so I trapped them in a demon stone where they would fight for all eternity.
In 2005, the first game set in Eberron was published, Dungeons & Dragons Dragon Shard, a real-time strategy game with some RPG elements. And then in 2006, we got the release of Dungeons & Dragons Online, although at the time it was marketed as Stormreach and then as Eberron Unlimited when it moved to a free-to-play model in 2009. This was the latest attempt for D&D to break into the MMO market that at this time was being completely dominated by World of Warcraft. Sadly though, it was never really able to compete with the Blizzard behemoth, but it was one of the major contributors to the rise of free-to-play business models for MMOs against the previously dominant subscription plans. Of course, 2006 also brought us Neverwinter Nights 2, which was developed by Obsidian as a sequel to BioWare's earlier game, although the story was mostly unrelated to its predecessor. The following year, it received the first of its 3 expansions, and we also got the release of Dungeons & Dragons Tactics for the PSP, which tried to use a strict interpretation of the 3.5 rule set, but ended up becoming a cumbersome mess of difficult to use interfaces. Following this, there was a pretty sizable gap in new releases, as all we got for the next few years were Neverwinter Nights 2 expansions and Facebook games. But eventually in 2011, D&D Daggerdale was released, a third-person action RPG based on a mixture of Dark Alliance and Dungeons & Dragons heroes. However, this was far from the saviour that D&D Video Games needed and received mostly negative reviews. In 2012, the original Baldur's Gate returned with the Enhanced Edition, and then a year later, Baldur's Gate 2 got the same treatment. 2013 also gave us Neverwinter, another MMORPG set in the city of the same name, but this one had no relation to the previous Neverwinter Nights series. The game is still going strong today, and over the years has received updates that coincide with new official adventures for the tabletop game, such as Tomb of Annihilation, Ravenloft, Rise of Tiamat, and Storm King's Thunder. In 2014, Icewind Dale received its Enhanced Edition re-release, and the board game Lords of Waterdeep got an electronic version for iOS and then later for Android and Steam. But by this point you've probably begun to notice that the earlier flood of new games each year had pretty much dried up, and single player games in particular were becoming fewer and further between. Ironically, this was also coming at a time when 5th edition was really starting to gain traction, with podcasts like Acquisitions Inc. exploding in popularity, and the first episodes of Critical Role bringing the game to a whole new audience. Disappointingly though, this success was never reflected in new video games, as in 2015, all we got was action RPG Sword Coast Legends that received mixed reviews at best. In 2016, things picked up a little bit with Baldur's Gate Siege of Dragonspear, an expansion for the new Enhanced Edition of the game, and the first piece of original content to be added to it for more than 15 years. Still, this was not enough to cause a resurgence in D&D video games, although titles like Pillars of Eternity and Original Sin had proved that there was still demand out there for games in the genre. But regardless, 2017, 18 and 19 have only brought with them enhanced editions of the old games, as well as non-RPG titles like Idle Champions, Tales from Candlekeep, and mobile game Warriors of Waterdeep. But then in mid-2019 our prayers were answered, when it was announced that Larian Studios were going to take us back to Baldur's Gate, with a completely new installment in the series that will be making full use of the 5th edition rule set. Larian are the developers behind the Divinity series, and had reportedly approached Wizards of the Coast back in 2014 about making Baldur's Gate 3. At the time, Wizards felt they were a little bit too new to the industry to be trusted with such an iconic and beloved license, but after the success of Original Sin 2, they decided they had seen enough proof of the developers' talents, and went to Larian themselves with an offer. So with the ever-growing success of D&D tabletop gaming, maybe this is the beginning of a resurgence for the franchise in the world of video games as well. But how do you feel? Would you like to see more D&D video games? Which locations or settings would you like to explore? Do you want more traditional RPGs that try to capture the tabletop experience? Or something more like The Witcher 3, but set in the Forgotten Realms? Let me know what you think in the comments below. And finally, if you're interested in more D&D content, I highly recommend checking out dndbeyond.com, where you can find articles, videos, books, and of course the official digital toolset of 5th edition. For now though, I've been James for Fandom, and thank you for watching.